When we use the phrase perfect timing, we are describing a situation where events align in such a way that something good happens, at least usually, right? For example, when we arrive home just when a package is being delivered at our door, perfect timing. Or when we arrive at the movie theater just after the previews but just before the movie, right? Perfect timing. Or when we fold the laundry with something in the oven, right? We're cooking something in the oven, we're out folding the laundry, we come back to check on what's in the oven just as the timer in the oven runs out. Perfect timing. Or when we bring in laundry from a clothesline outside just before a small army of seagulls descends on our neighborhood, leaving their droppings all over the place. Perfect timing. Am I right?
Yes.
Now I know what some of you are thinking. Gee, Sam, that was an oddly specific example. Did that really happen to you? To which I would reply, I can neither confirm nor deny that scenario actually happened in my life experience. Wink, wink. Perfect timing. In the gospel reading for today, in Mark chapter 5, we read a profound story. And I want to walk through the elements of this story with you one more time. First of all, we have this man named Jairus, who comes, he's a leader of the synagogue, who comes to find Jesus in desperation. He knows his daughter is sick, so sick that she may even die. And so he comes to Jesus, hoping he can bring Jesus to his house, and Jesus can lay hands on his daughter, and she can be healed and brought back from the edge of death. Well, Jesus agrees. Jesus decides he will go with Jairus to see his daughter. And then we start to follow the story, and something else interrupts that journey. As they're making their way from where Jesus was to Jairus' house, there's a huge crowd of people all cramming together around Jesus. They're stuck and stuffed into the street. It's shoulder to shoulder, everyone packed in with one another. And in that crowd of people is a woman who has been dealing with a major health issue for 12 years. 12 years she has had a condition of hemorrhaging blood. And no one has been able to help her. No doctor's been able to heal her. It's only gotten worse and worse over 12 years. But she thinks to herself, if I can just reach out and grab the hem of his robe, just a little bit of thread at the back end of his robe, maybe, just maybe, there's hope for healing for me. And so this is what she does. She finds her way through that crowd of people and reaches out from behind just to grab the very bottom end of the back of his robe. And in a moment, in a flash, she realizes it worked. She can tell, she can sense in her body that she's been healed. And most likely, she's sort of in awe of this, and the crowd is still kind of moving forward. But Jesus notices something too. In that story that I read for you, Jesus knows when power has left him. He noticed when something happened. He knew something was different. And so he asks that very interesting and sort of comical question, who touched me? And the disciples are like, wait a minute, you do realize that we're packed in here like sardines. 17 people have touched you, right? We're all packed in here. It's super tight. How can you ask such a question? But Jesus knows that what this touch means is very different. And he's seeking out that person who touched him. And the woman comes forward. She says, she's afraid. Mark tells us she's afraid, but she comes forward and she says, it was me. I touched you. Jesus knows that the power went out of him to heal and restore her. She has experienced a miraculous healing. Now, there's a lot of stuff in this story that if we didn't do our homework, we might miss. That makes it very important. In this day and this time in history, in this culture, for a woman to touch a man, it was a big no-no. Okay? It was not acceptable for a woman to just walk up and touch a man. Additionally, it was also a problem for someone who was sick, like she was, to touch someone who was healthy. And there's all these religious and cultural expectations around that. But what you need to know this morning is that this woman was willing to break down all these rules and social norms to get to Jesus. She was willing because she needed healing. And Jesus, he doesn't do what you would expect. In that culture, in that time, you would expect him to condemn her or to tell her that she messed up or she broke the rules by touching him. But he doesn't do that. Jesus doesn't abide by those rules. He's really happy for her. He feels joy for her. He says, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace." It's really amazing when you think about it that Jesus refers to this woman as daughter. That's a very personal, special term for a person. For him to call her daughter was to say, "You're part of my family." That's a very special way to refer to someone. Now, all of this is amazing, right? It's just amazing to read a story like this that has a miracle in it and an amazing occurrence of healing and someone reaching out and experiencing this amazing reward for their faith in the healing of a major issue with their body. But remember how the story began? Where did it begin? It began with Jairus. What's Jairus doing right now? He's freaking out. Right? I can empathize. I'm a dad with a daughter. If I had come to Jesus like Jairus did, and I had been desperate, hoping he would come and touch my daughter and heal her, then the internal clock in my body would be screaming at me right now. Why are we paused? I came to you first. What is holding us up, Jesus? Who cares who touched you? Let's go. My daughter's dying. Right? All that stuff is inside Jairus' chest right now. That internal clock is ticking louder and louder because he's afraid. He desperately wants to see his daughter healed. Well then, people come from Jairus' house and deliver the bad news. Right? We read that in the story. Someone comes to tell Jairus, "Don't bother Jesus anymore. She's passed. It's over." Now I have to imagine that in that moment, Jairus is flooded with a whole bunch of thoughts and feelings. Feelings of grief and anger and shock. Thoughts of, why didn't I get to Jesus faster? Why didn't Jesus move quicker? Why did Jesus let this interruption happen? What could have been? Could my daughter still be alive if things hadn't happened along the way? But then again, what's Jesus' response? Don't be afraid. I heard the news too. Jesus listened. He heard that. And he tells Jairus, don't be afraid. Let's continue. They make their way to Jairus' house. Jesus says those really powerful words of, "Why are all of you crying? She's only asleep." Of course, everyone knows she's dead, and so they laugh at Jesus. They think he must be mad or crazy to say something like that. But Jesus sends everyone out of the house except for Mom, Dad, and 3 disciples. And Jesus walks over to that girl, touches her hand, says, "Get up." And she does. She wakes up. She comes back to life. Now, imagine you are Jairus. You just went through the desperation of running to Jesus to bring him to your daughter. You went through the shock and the frustration and the anger and all the feelings and thoughts of hearing the bad news that your daughter had died. And now the whole thing's flipped upside down because Jesus actually got there and brought her back to life. That's a pretty big roller coaster for Jairus, right? That's a lot of emotions and feelings and thoughts and fearful, scary places. But this is one of my favorite stories about Jesus, and it illustrates how God views time. It appears that God is not in a rush, that God is not driven by the clock. After all, God created time, which means God doesn't need to speed things up to get things done, nor does he have to borrow time or rush or make up for lost time. All these things we do, right? God created time. God's timing is perfect. What is often out of alignment is our perception of God's timing. Sometimes we have it in our heads that something was meant to go a certain way, and when it doesn't, we think, God, where are you? Excuse me? Are you sleeping? Did you miss something, God? But our faith tradition teaches us that often what's missing is not God's timing or activity. Rather, what is missing is our faith and trust in God's timing. And often God's timing is different than ours. It's not always aligned with what we expect or what we hope. Our faith tradition talks about integrating all things into the flow of life and time. We experience joy and blessing, grief and loss, hope and excitement, anger and disappointment, but these aren't neat boxes that are kept separate from each other in our lives. They're all part of the flow of life and time. They're all part of human experience. We've all felt these things. We've all experienced these things. The question is, like Jairus in the story, can we give our fears over to God? Can we trust God to do what only God can do in God's timing? I won't sugarcoat this for you. This is one of the most difficult aspects of the journey of faith. It involves patience and sometimes a lot of waiting. Two things that we as Americans living in the 21st century are notoriously terrible at. Patience and waiting, right? But our faith tradition teaches us that we can find peace even in very troubling and challenging circumstances when we trust God's timing. So the invitation for you and for me is that we set the pace of our faith clock to the cadence of God's clock. If we're paying attention to God's activity and God's way of communicating with us, we will hear the words God spoke to Jairus often. Do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. Fear not. I am here. I love you. You are not alone. My timing is perfect. Doesn't always feel like it, but it is perfect. May we live in the flow of God's time, today and every day. Amen? Amen. Let's continue with the hymn, O Worship the King.